I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation.
My name is Robert Benham. I'm a retired judge and lawyer whose professional career was spent in Memphis, Tennessee. The purpose of this course was to expose people of all ages to the civil rights movement in the South that existed between the years 1955, ending with the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968. The first part of today's presentation will be based on Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. And in your bibliography, you'll find two books, Rosa Parks, My Story, and The Rebellious Life of Ms. Rosa Parks by Jean Theo Harris, which I relied on very, very heavily for the information that's going to be the subject of today's presentation. We're going to now shift to Montgomery, Alabama, and we're going to hear about Montgomery in more than one of the lectures today. But Montgomery is the state capital of Alabama, and there's the Capitol building. Here is the federal courthouse. Here is the first Confederate White House, and here is the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. The Dexter Avenue Baptist Church was the first church that Martin Luther King was pastor of, and as we'll see as we get into the subject matter today, he's very much involved in this story, and this is his self-initiation into the civil rights movement. First is a bit of history. Montgomery was founded in 1819, became the capital of the state of Alabama in 1846, and was the first capital of the Confederacy. It is where Jefferson Davis was sworn in as the first and only president of the Confederacy. Today, and this is somewhat of a dichotomy, Montgomery is home to the Southern Poverty Law Center, and this is their new headquarters, as well as the Equal Justice Initiative founded by Bryan Stevenson. Bryan Stevenson spoke here in Santa Barbara at UCSB several years ago. It was probably the most engaging presentation I have ever heard in my 80-some-odd years. He's scheduled to return and do another presentation here, and if you haven't heard him, or even if you've heard him, I would urge that you go and listen again. He's quite a speaker and quite a writer. He wrote the book Just Mercy, and he is also the founder of the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, that focuses on all of the lynchings that occurred between Reconstruction and the 20th century, and you've got hanging, no pun intended, plaques commemorating people that they've identified who were unceremoniously hung during this period of time following the Civil War. Now, I personally know of one person who was a youngster in Walthall County, Mississippi, was forced by her father to watch such a hanging and suffered nightmares throughout the rest of her life based on this unwanted experience. Now let's focus on 1955 and the state of Alabama. Here you see the state of Alabama on the map. On the north, it's bordered by Tennessee. On the east, by Georgia. On the south, by Florida, or the panhandle of Florida, which a whole lot of people think ought to be seceded to Alabama. And on the west, by Mississippi. In 1955, Montgomery, as we show its position in the southeast portion of the state, had a population of approximately 125,000. The racial makeup was about 60% white and 40% black. What's more relevant is that the municipal bus system's racial passenger makeup was 75% black. By 1955, Montgomery had a long history of racial prejudice and unrest. A substantial portion of this emanated from the public transportation system. Now, in 1955 and throughout the South, with which I was personally familiar, housing was segregated, jobs for blacks involved the lowest paid, and so black people as a group largely depended on public transportation that, as I just said, was 75% black. Montgomery was the home to Maxwell Air Force Base, and all of the military installations in the country at that point in time depended on a lot of people who happened to be black, who did some of the menial work that was not delegated to privates such as myself, who had the privilege of serving 4 days straight on KP on one instance. As a result, there were numerous instances of military personnel as well as civilians who worked at Maxwell and who were dependent on bus service to get to and from work and were having altercations with bus drivers. As an example, in 1950, one Hilliard Brooks, a veteran who had just returned from fulfilling his service obligation, refused to enter and exit a bus through the back door. The police were called. The officer hit Brooks with his club, and when Brooks tried to exit the bus, the officer shot Brooks, who died as a result of this particular altercation. 1 year later, a lady by the name of Epsie Worthy, and I've tried as best as I can to put names and places together so people can look at the people we're talking about or the places we were talking about, but I could not find a picture of Epsie Worthy. But apparently she exited a bus after she had a verbal altercation with the driver. The driver followed her off the bus and began hitting her. She fought back. The police were called, and she was charged with disorderly conduct and fined $52. Now, this is 1951, and $52 was far more than many working people made in a week. I well remember that in the summer of 1952, I was working for 60 cents an hour and thankful for the job. There were numerous other instances of altercations between white bus drivers and black passengers over the years, and even into 1955. In the New York Times, just last year, October 22nd, there was an article about Claudette Colvin, a 15-year-old who had such a run-in on March 2nd of 1955. This was followed by Lucille Times, who in June of 1955 had an altercation that resulted in a one-woman brief boycott of the transportation system. What I personally learned from my good friend Benjamin Hooks was that there was a certain hierarchy within the African American community, that in selecting what I call crosses on which to die, there was a concerted effort to find the right person at the right time with the right appearance, and those were the qualifications that were a perfect fit for Rosa Parks. Now, Ben, or as I referred to him as Judge Hooks, was in a position to know. Ben Hooks was a lawyer practicing in Memphis when I moved to Memphis in January of 1965. He was one of less than a dozen black lawyers practicing in Memphis. And toward the end of 65 or the first of 1966, new division of the criminal courts of Shelby County was established, and the governor appointed Hooks as criminal court judge. This was the first time since Reconstruction that a black served on the bench and a court of record in the South. So from the end of Reconstruction, 1875 or thereabouts, until 1965, 1966, there were no black judges. After a couple of years on the bench, Hooks was appointed to fill a seat on the Federal Communications Commission, moved to Washington in order to do that. And at the same time, he was pastor of the Middle Baptist Church in Memphis and a church in Detroit. So he did his work for the government 5 days a week. One weekend he went to Memphis for that church. The next weekend he went to Detroit for that church. How he managed to pull all that off, I'll never know, but he was quite a speaker. Additionally, following several years on the Federal Communications Commission, he became executive director of the NAACP and served in that capacity for about 18 years. So he was someone who knew and was quite involved in the movement to get the right people at the right time for the right cases. He was also the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2005, when it was not nearly, let's say, as political as it has been in the past administration. I was fortunate enough to be with him at the White House on that occasion, and there were some interesting people that were recipients. Francis Collins, who is now retiring at NIH, was a recipient. One of my heroes and person I idealized who was there was Harper Lee, who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird. Everybody said she was a recluse. I happened to have the privilege of having I'm not going to say a few minutes, but maybe a minute talking to her, maybe. And I found her very warm and open. So there was also the president of Liberia. Last name I think was Sirleaf, but these were the caliber of people that were being honored. Now, let's digress. Let's go back into the history of Rosa Parks. And we digress maybe too much. Rosa Parks was born on February 4th, 1913 in Tuskegee, Alabama, which is not far from Montgomery. This is her birthplace. Her mother was Leona Edwards, and her father was James McCauley. Leona was a teacher, and James a home builder. Rosa had little contact with her father, who was away for extended periods of time. My saying away for extended periods of time is an understatement. After the birth of Rosa's brother, the family stayed together until Rosa was 2.5 and her brother a newborn. This is Rosa as a child, and this, I think, is the picture of the family portrait. When she next saw her father, she was 5. She looks older than 5 to me on the picture, but her brother was 3, and he looks like about 3 in that picture. Again, her father left, and she didn't see him again until she was a married adult. Needless to say, she grew up in a broken family atmosphere, or as we say, a single-parent atmosphere, blessed with grandparents who cared. The grandparents with whom Rosa lived were located in Pine Level, Alabama, which is a tiny suburb just outside of Montgomery. Rosa's great-grandfather was a white plantation owner, and her great-grandmother was a slave housekeeper. In the South, that was referred to as house, as opposed to field, which was people that worked out in the picking cotton, soybeans, or whatever. Reportedly, she, the great-grandmother, was of mixed blood because Rosa's grandfather could, if they say, passed. That is, passed for white. Rosa's mother went to school in Pine Level through the 6th grade in this type of school, which was prevalent throughout the South for black children. I don't know where she went to high school, could never find that out, but later she went to PAYNE University in Selma, where she obtained a teaching certificate. While Rosa's mother had to travel to a teaching job, only returning home on weekends, Rosa, under the tutelage of her grandparents, started school at age 6 in Pine Level, a segregated school where black children went for 5 months a year, while white students in public schools went 9 months. And I think this is very, very relevant, because you have all these sociologists who do research, and some said that blacks couldn't learn the way whites could learn. Well, this is one of the reasons. This is one of the reasons. Whites went to school 9 months, blacks went to school 5 months, and why? Because black children had to be available for both chopping and harvesting cotton. For chopping, that's weeding and thinning, and this is strenuous work. They were paid 50 cents a day, and for picking, $1 per 100 pounds. In Rosa's words, they worked from can to can. Needless to say, these were not privileged children. Since schools in Pine Level went to the 6th grade, Rosa was sent to live with relatives in Montgomery in order to continue her education. It was there, according to Rosa herself, that she first exhibited resistance to white bullying. While she was walking home from school, a white boy on roller skates attempted to push her off the sidewalk, and she turned around and pushed him. The boy's mother was there and told Rosa that she, Rosa, could be jailed for pushing a white person. And these are her words, her description of it. One day, my cousin Annie Mae, some other children, and I were walking from school. My cousins went to public school. I was the only one in the family who went to Miss White's school. Anyway, this time we were walking, a white boy was coming along on roller skates, and for some reason he chose me to try and push me off the sidewalk. I turned around and pushed him. A white woman was standing not too far from us. She turned out to be his mother because she said she could put me in jail, so far in jail that I would never go out again for pushing her child. So I told her that he had pushed me and that I didn't want to be pushed, seeing that I wasn't bothering him at all. My mother decided after that incident that it would be better for me to move back with my cousins. She didn't want me passing through white neighborhoods to get to and from Aunt Fanny's every day. The incident with the white boy on roller skates was the most threatening, but a lot of times white youngsters would approach us and threaten us. Rosa went to a laboratory school, and that's what they called it, at Alabama Normal School in Montgomery through the 10th grade, but had to drop out in the 11th to take care of a sick grandmother. It was not long afterwards that she married Raymond Parks, and that was in 1932. Rosa did eventually go back to school and received a high school diploma in 1933 when she was 20. Raymond was an activist joining the NAACP, which was fledgling, to say the least, in Alabama, and was quite active in attempting to raise money in order to defend the Scottsboro Boys. Scottsboro Boys was a landmark case that went to the United States Supreme Court twice on 2 separate issues, and we could spend days talking about the Scottsboro Boys and those cases, but just in a paragraph, briefly, 9 African Americans were hoboing, riding the rails, on a train that ran from Chattanooga to Memphis, somewhere around Paint Rock, Alabama, and that's 45 minutes to an hour out of Chattanooga. There was an incident, and they were accused of raping 2 white girls of extremely questionable character. They were indicted, that is, the Scottsboro Boys. They were tried and convicted of rape in the courthouse in Scottsboro. The first conviction was overturned on the grounds that they lacked effective counsel. They were retried and again convicted. This conviction was overturned on the grounds that the jury pool was tainted in that there was a systematic exclusion of blacks from the jury pool. While the saga of the Scottsboro Boys went on literally for decades, it was one more galvanizing influence resulting in African Americans asserting their cause that ultimately resulted in the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. Rosa, under the influence of Edgar Daniel Nixon, E.D. Nixon, then head of the NAACP in Montgomery, became active in attempting to register black voters, again in Montgomery. In the 40s, according to Rosa, there were 31 black registered voters in Montgomery. And she says, quote, some of them were in the cemetery, end quote. It took Rosa 3 tries to get registered, but finally she did in 1945. That is, she had to take the test 3 times. And the test was given to blacks, not necessarily whites. I would not say not necessarily. It was not given to whites. It was given to blacks. She had to pay a $1.50 poll tax retroactive to age 21. She was then 32 and had to pay $16.50, which in those days was a lot of money. Rosa became secretary of the Montgomery branch of the NAACP in the 40s and became quite active in voter registration. But revival of the Klan and white resistance caused NAACP membership to fall from 1,600 to 148 by 1949. In the summer of 1955, Rosa went to Monteagle, Tennessee to attend a workshop advertised as Racial Desegregation Implementing the Supreme Court Decision. And we're talking about the recently decided Brown case. This was being held at the Highlander Folk School, which one Miles Horton had co-founded in the early 1930s in order to address and implement interracial leadership training. Obviously, at this point, Interstate 24 did not exist.
Right.
This is the best map I could produce to show you the geographical area we're talking about. But Highway 41 existed, and I-24 parallels Highway 41 for many, many miles between Chattanooga and Nashville. Highway 41 was a legendary route people took from Chicago to Florida for many, many, many years. Monteagle Mountain, where Highlander was established, is kind of an interesting place. Here we see a study group at Highlander, and in the group, Rosa Parks. And growing up, it was always my impression that Highlander and Horton were implementing communism. Where did I learn that? The newspaper. Highlander Folk School, Communist Training School, Monteagle, Tennessee. And like Will Rogers, all I knew was what I read in the newspaper, so I assumed it was a communist training ground. And I can't think of a more dangerous place for African Americans to gather than in Grundy County, Tennessee. When I finished law school, even in 1963, there were no lawyers, to my knowledge, maintaining offices in Grundy County, where Monteagle is located, because it was too dangerous. It's too dangerous in many counties in Tennessee to practice law, because people, they didn't have AR-15s, but they had plenty of dynamite and plenty of shotguns. In researching for this presentation, I could find only 3 or 4 maintaining offices there today, and most lawyers who practice in this general area come there from Chattanooga, Winchester, Jasper. Monteagle is located on what's known as the Cumberland Plateau, and while there's some logging, one of the main industries is moonshine. And when I left Chattanooga to move to Memphis, in the federal district court in Chattanooga, virtually 70% of the cases that were criminal cases that were being tried were ATU cases because of moonshine. It was a big industry. And curiously enough, though, and I've never quite gotten this, this is the area where you have site of the University of the South, also known as SEWANEE, that has a campus that looks just like Oxford. It's funded very much by the Episcopal Church, but you look at all the founders, and the founders, main founders, were all Confederate generals during the Civil War, the chief benefactor of whom probably had more slaves than anybody else in the state of Tennessee. He was called Bishop Leonidas Polk. He was a cousin of President Polk. He lived near Columbia, Tennessee, and when the war broke out, he only had 400 slaves. He was a major funder with the Episcopal Church that established SEWANEE. How they coexisted with Highlander, I'll never know. This was probably Rosa's first trip outside of Montgomery, and as I said, she went to an all-white county. In Jean Theo Harris' biography of Rosa, it was interesting that, quote, Parks particularly liked Horton's tongue-in-cheek response to reporters who repeatedly asked how he manages to get blacks and whites at Highlander to eat together. He says, first, the food is prepared. Second, it is put on the table. Third, we ring the bell. Now let's remember this was over 60 years ago, and in the South it was unthinkable for blacks and whites to have meaningful discussions or socialize. It was a master-servant relationship society, and the NAACP was, in the white community, a red-baiting, subversive organization. In fact, in South Carolina, all state employees, that is, black employees, were required to renounce their membership or lose their jobs. For the first time in her life, Rosa Parks at Highlander was exposed to the possibility that there could be a black-white unified society. Horton taught and Parks believed that Christianity both required and reinforced activism and social justice. Parks returned to Montgomery after 2 weeks at Highlander with the drive and dedication to urge the youth of Montgomery to affiliate with the NAACP, and at the same time returned to her job as a seamstress in a store called Montgomery Fair, where she altered garments of white customers. It was just a few weeks later, in 1955, that news of the Emmett Till murder took place. And we explored that last week. And 4 days later, on November 27, 1955, Parks attended a packed meeting at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church that called attention to both the Till lynching and the murder of Lamar Lee and George Smith, murdered for attempting to register or cause others to register. Last week we showed pictures of them. We talked about the murder, particularly Lamar Lee, who was killed literally on the courthouse lawn on a Saturday, and there was never an indictment or a prosecution. While the FBI agents said there should have been, it seems like there was somebody above them in D.C. that quashed a lot of these, a lot of them. It was another 4 days later, December 1, 1955, when Rosa Parks made her stand. In the words of the poet, Nikki Giovanni, quote, "This is about the moment Rosa Parks shouldered her cross, put her worldly goods aside, and was willing to sacrifice her life so that the young man in Money, Mississippi would not have died in vain." Ms. Rosa Parks could not stand that death, and in not being able to stand for it, she sat back down. And this is a reenactment, frankly, of the December 1, 1955 bus seating. If you're ever in Memphis, then the Civil Rights Museum, there is an exact replica of it, and it's quite a treat to see that, plus many of the other exhibits there. As a result, Rosa was arrested and fingerprinted. She got her mug shot and was booked. This was not the first bus dispute, and several of the most egregious are depicted in the Theo Harris biography. This is a quote from that biography, and this one just really rang bells with me. Years before, Viola White, who worked at Maxwell Air Force Base, was beaten and arrested for refusing to give up her seat. Found guilty, White then appealed her case to the circuit court. The city of Montgomery knew they couldn't win, E.D. Nixon explained, and we couldn't get on the court calendar. The case was held up indefinitely, and while it was being held up, and shortly afterwards, the police retaliated, and a white police officer seized White's 16-year-old daughter and raped her. The daughter had the presence of mind to memorize the cop's license plate and boldly reported the crime. After many attempts by Nixon, a warrant for the officer's arrest was issued, but the police chief tipped off the officer, who left town. Viola White died, derailing any further legal action. These were just egregious cases, and they happened one after another for decades. Oftentimes, drivers in the bus system would take bus fare at the front of the bus and then force black patrons to go to the back in order to get on the bus, and on many occasions would drive off and just leave them standing there. Criminal justice was even today in many areas a misnomer if one is black. One of my heroes, Justice Brennan, said it's best, and there's a one-page quote in your handout, and I would really, really encourage you reading it. It was one that I utilized a lot when I was privileged to be on the bench and when I saw litigants who were underrepresented. And I would, at the conclusion of the proof on that day, would ask the lawyer who was not doing his or her job to come up to the bench. I would hand him a copy of this and ask him to please read it and see me in the morning and tell me how it affected him. I did that on many, many, many occasions. A lot of people say, what was the hardest job you had as a judge? And frankly, the hardest job I had was protecting litigants from their own lawyers. I was just amazed at how underprepared people tended to be. But let's get back to Rosa Parks. News of the arrest spread throughout the black community at 3 a.m. On the 2nd. Joanne Robinson, head of the Women's Political Council, called E.D. Nixon, remember he was head of the NAACP, suggesting a boycott of the Montgomery buses. Robinson recruited 20 women, and over the next days, the WPC, as it was called, distributed more than 35,000 leaflets throughout the community promoting the boycott. Robinson is somebody you don't hear an awful lot about, but initiating the boycott and in implementing the boycott, she was very, very instrumental in doing the logistics of coordinating people with rides in order for them to be able to get to school or get to work, and just did a yeoman's type effort for over 12 months. The following Friday, there was to be a meeting of ministers at the Dexter Avenue Church, which had a relatively new minister, Martin Luther King Jr. Now, King was initially hesitant to get involved in all of this, but finally, with a lot of prodding, he was brought on board. King at that point in time was 26 years old, and hopefully the video we're going to play in a minute will show him as a very, very young man. King took up the cudgel, and on the Monday after the Friday rally, they hoped for a 60% reduction in black riders on the Montgomery buses. The vast majority of the African American community did, as I say, use the buses for going to and from school and work. But much to King's amazement and that of Rosa, the buses were virtually empty. The sidewalks, the streets of Montgomery were filled with black women and men walking, waiting, and offering rides. Black taxis charged the same as the bus fare. On the 5th of December, Rosa appeared in court, accompanied by a mass of blacks who lined the sidewalk. She was convicted and fined $14 and immediately filed an appeal. That evening, over 15,000 people gathered in and around the Holt Street Baptist Church, where Dr. King took the pulpit. He had not had time to prepare a speech, and at first appeared to be a bit nervous, but then found his stride. And I wish I could have found this on YouTube, but I couldn't. But this is the quote: "When people get tired, we are here this evening to say to those who have mistreated us so long that we are tired. Tired of being segregated and humiliated, tired of being kicked about by the brutal feet of oppression. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. God Almighty is wrong. If we are wrong, justice is a lie. Right here in Montgomery, when the history books are written in the future, somebody will have to say there lived a great people, a black people, who injected new meaning and dignity into the veins of civilization." And so the boycott continued. People waved at the buses, people walked, people boycotted, and the Montgomery Improvement Association raised money to transport people, and they arranged up to 15,000 to 20,000 rides a day, which is unbelievable. The MIA met with the mayor and city commission, and there were but 3 demands. 1, first come, first served seating on buses. 2, courteous treatment of passengers. 3, hiring of black bus drivers. This was rejected. Then a lawsuit was filed in the Federal District Court of Montgomery, challenging both Montgomery and Alabama statutes and ordinances enforcing racial segregation on buses. The action styled Browder versus Gale would ultimately end up in the United States Supreme Court. The Montgomery Advertiser ran an editorial calling the boycott a dangerous weapon like a missile that returns to its launching ground. They reminded black leaders that white man's economic artillery is far superior and commanded by more experienced gunners, and that the white man holds all the offices of government machinery. The paper's editors saw segregation and white power as a fixed truth, pronouncing there will be white rule as long and as far as the eye can see.
That the resolution as read will be received and adopted. Are you ready for the question? All in favor, let it be known by standing on your feet. That was the day that we started a bus protest which literally electrified the nation. And that was the day when we decided that we were not going to take segregated buses any longer. And you know, when we planned the bus boycott, we said if we could just get about 50 or 60% of the Negroes of Montgomery not to ride buses, this would be an effective boycott. I think that whole day we found 8 Negroes on the buses. And from that day on, that boycott was more than 99 9/10% effective. For several weeks now, we, the Negro citizens of Montgomery, have been involved in a non-violent protest against the injustices which we have experienced on the buses for a number of years. We feel that we are right. We have a legitimate right, a legitimate protest. And we feel also that one of the great glories of American democracy is that we have the right to protest for rights. We will do it in an orderly fashion. This is a non-violent protest. We are depending on moral and spiritual forces, using the method of passive resistance. I remember that Monday morning when I was subpoenaed to be in court, the chief defendant. Many things ran through my mind. And I started thinking about the people. All day long trying to think of something to say to the people. Finally, I tried to talk. My words were fumbling a bit. Let us fight passionately and unrelentingly for the goal of justice and freedom. Let's be sure that our hands are clean in the struggle. Let us never fight with falsehood and violence and hate and malice, but always fight with love, so that when the day comes that the walls of segregation is completely crumbled in Montgomery, we will be able to live with people as their brothers and sisters. It is true that 115 of us have been indicted by the grand jury Yet, our actions as of this day have not as yet been found to be illegal. The carpool and all we have done in this struggle continues. Now I say to you, my friends, rise up and know that as you struggle for justice, you do not struggle alone, but God struggles with you. Freedom is never given to anybody, for the oppressor has you in domination because he plans to keep you there and he never voluntarily gives it up. That is where the strong resistance comes. We've got to keep on keeping on in order to gain freedom. It is not done voluntarily, but it is done through the pressure that comes about from people who are oppressed. Privileged classes never give up their privileges without strong resistance. The executive board of the Montgomery Improvement Association recommends that the 11-month-old protest against the city buses will be called off and that the Negro citizens of Montgomery, Alabama will return to the buses on a non-segregated basis. It is further recommended that this return to the buses will not take place until the mandate from the United States Supreme Court is turned over to the Federal District Court. We have the assurance from authentic sources that this mandate will come to Montgomery in a matter of just a few days. For those 3 or 4 days, we will continue to walk and shall rise.
I hereby defy a ruling handed down by the United States Supreme Court ordering desegregation of public carriers. Alabama state law requiring segregation of races on buses still stands. As long as I am president of the Alabama Public Service Commission, I am going to see that our segregation laws are upheld.
I have this day issued orders to the Chief of Police and the Police Department.
What we saw was a 26-year-old Martin Luther King in what would define really the rest of his life as he got involved in the civil rights movement. At the end, you can see that the good people of Montgomery, or the leaders of Montgomery, are still defying the order, except the last squib was the federal district court judge who told them they could defy all they want, but he was going to put them in jail. And he was very clear about that. I thought the film was moving, but there are some things that it did not show that people experienced during this year. There were many attempts to break the boycott. Walkers and persons driving carpools were often pelted with food, stones, urine, and other things. The police were always harassing those driving carpools by pulling them over and giving them tickets. Joanne Robinson, who we spoke about minutes ago, received 17 tickets within a period of a few months. A rock was thrown into the front window of her residence by a police officer, and 2 others threw acid over her vehicle. Drivers found gas tanks filled with sugar, and on occasion brakes were tampered with. Crosses were burned on the campus of Alabama State University, a black school, and Martin Luther King was arrested for speeding. Then insurers were persuaded to cancel automobile insurance for drivers of cars used in pooling. and black taxis. Fortunately, they were able to obtain insurance through Lloyd's of London. On January 30th of 1956, white vigilantes threw a bomb into the King home, and on February 21st, 115 of the boycott leaders were indicted. And we saw Ralph Abernathy addressing that. But in the middle of all of this, the Supreme Court came down with its landmark case of Browder versus Gale, and there was a reaffirmation of the principle that separate facilities are inherently unequal, and again, that the old Plessy doctrine that we talked about last week is no longer valid sociologically or legally. But did it end well? Not necessarily. Rosa Parks and her husband had to leave Montgomery. They moved to Detroit, and it was only after her death that she got a lot of the recognition that she deserved, because as I recall, she laid in state at the United States Capitol. Let's take a break, and then we're moving from January of '57 till September of '57, and we're moving from Montgomery to Little Rock.